I suspect that the SNP will not go into the Holyrood election in 2026 on the de facto referendum. Where I think that they ought to concentrate, and this is my sort of view as a political observer, is simply to make the point that they have had several mandates before when they have pledged such a referendum, but of course Westminster has said no, and the Supreme Court has already, in a sense, upheld the constitutional inevitable, which we all understood, which was that in a reserved issue and changing the constitutional status of the United Kingdom, it doesn't become more reserved than that. The Supreme Court have made the point that an attempt by the Scottish Parliament to hold such a referendum would be an attempt to introduce legislation which is ultra-vires. The Parliament does not have the constitutional authority to hold and stage such a referendum. The much more fundamental question, which I think the SNP should concentrate on, is a basic issue of democracy, and it is to ask a simple question and to have a simple question answered. What are the circumstances in which the Parliament can call a referendum? Is the situation that we had in 1999, the constitutional settlement, fit for purpose? Because it does not strike to me to be remotely democratic that one Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, constitutionally can forever imprison a devolved legislature when a party wins an election on a clear mandate in order to pursue that. There is a world of difference between saying independence is a good idea, but nevertheless, even if you think it's a bad idea, many people will think, nevertheless, you have the right to choose, and therefore the circumstances are, when should you have the right to choose?
You have the right to choose, I would suggest, Bernard, but you do not necessarily always have the right to choose at any and every moment that one political party demands it. I mean, if you look at the United Kingdom...
There should therefore be a mechanism which is agreed between both parliaments, which is clearly understood. I mean, it gets round this point of never-endums. Of course, if you lose a constitutional referendum in 1 year, coming back the following year or the year after that.
But that is current SNP policy. Is that if you ask the leaders of the SNP, if there were a second independence referendum and you lost it again, would you accept that result, or would you continue to think that we should have a third referendum? And they cannot answer that honestly. Well, they duck the question because their actual answer is, well, no, of course we should have a third referendum. Look.
So on the basic question, how do you get to it?
Well, I think you do it the way that, there's been a process. You have an agreed referendum when all parties agree it is reasonable and acceptable to put the question, which was what, after all, happened in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. There is a consensus then. The United Kingdom is really unusual amongst advanced democracies in having mechanisms.
What there is a veto.
No, it's not a veto. If there is a veto, it's a veto that is imposed by the people of Scotland, who have made it quite clear they don't want a referendum.
It is a veto which is imposed by the constitutional settlement.
But let me finish, please.
The constitutional settlement is such that you need the authority of the Westminster Parliament.
No, you need the agreement, not the authority.
You need the agreement. You need the agreement, and in the absence of such agreement, that effectively amounts to a veto.
No, it doesn't, because let's go back to first principles and so on. If you are a secessionist movement in any other Western European democracy, or indeed Western democracy full stop, there are no means by which you can constitutionally advance your case for the peaceful dismemberment of the nation state. Good luck in Spain, in France, in Germany, in the United States, even in Canada now. There is just no way you can do it. The United Kingdom grants unusual levels of tolerance, indeed some would say indulgence towards separatist movements, not just in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland, where there is a mechanism for in which a referendum
can be
held.
Why is there a mechanism there?
Well, I'm quite happy to copy the Northern Irish example, if you like, and so on, and say that, yes, the Secretary of State can decide whether there's to be a referendum or not. Now, I've mentioned this to SNP supporters and SNP politicians in the past and said, by all means emulate the Northern Irish example. Ask Alistair Jack as was, or ask Ian Murray now, if the conditions for a referendum to be held have been met? And the answer is, well, no, they haven't. And they haven't been met in Northern Ireland. But if you were to transpose the Northern Ireland example to Scotland, then yes, you can have a referendum, but only if the Secretary of State is satisfied it is likely to lead to a change in constitutional outcome. So even by those provisions and so on, there are absolutely no grounds at present for having a second independence referendum in Scotland. This notion that winning an election at Holyrood necessarily constitutes a mandate for a second referendum. Well, yes, on one level, sure, I can understand why people of an SNP persuasion think that and claim that. But this would be a referendum imposed on an awful lot of people who do not want it. Whereas, in 2011, when the SNP won their majority in Holyrood, there was a widespread acceptance from people across Scotland that yes, it was reasonable to have a referendum. It was reasonable to put the question, partly because it hadn't been put before, and partly because people, as a result of that, accepted the SNP's mandate to do it. But the mandate for a first referendum is clearly, I think, very different from the mandate for a second referendum when you're wanting to re-ask the same question simply because you didn't like the answer given in the first one. And that is the problem that the SNP have, is that they haven't actually persuaded people that there really are compelling grounds for a second referendum.
Okay, you have a look and see if there's another question, because we're not going to agree on this.
But that's okay. We don't have to agree on everything.
Well, we don't have to agree on everything.
This is not Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell.
I simply come back to the point that there is a basic question about whether or not the Scotland Act is fit for purpose. I do not believe on the issue of how a devolved legislature takes forward a constitutional proposal, in this case for independence, that because it takes two to tango, and it does take two to tango, if one doesn't tango, and Westminster has made it perfectly clear it will not tango, the decision not to tango therefore amounts to a constitutional veto, despite the fact a political party has put a prospectus before the country, has won a very, very significant mandate for it. And in the context of 2015, 56 out of 59 seats.
But that was on an election where the SNP explicitly said this is not a vote for independence.
Let me finish my argument. The Conservatives go ahead with a hard Brexit, with a percentage share of the vote which is smaller than that which was being gathered by the SNP. And they go ahead with that. Fine. Those are the rules. You have if you can form a government, if you have a manifesto where you've made a commitment, you have a mandate in order to take that forward. The issue is, and therefore I think that rather than concentrate on the issue of the substantive point of independence, what the SNP may well be able to unite around in the coming months is to mount a campaign which is simply to ask people, are you happy with a constitutional settlement, which means that even if the SNP win a clear majority in the Scottish Parliament on a clear prospectus, as a result of the votes of people in Scotland, it is unable to take it forward because the Westminster Parliament has said no, because the current system, however you describe it, effectively amounts to a veto.
But these things are all contingent on public opinion and actual because I speak to conservative politicians and Labour politicians and so on, and they say quite honestly, quite openly, they don't approve of independence. They oppose a second referendum, but they will say if it is obvious that 65% of people demand a referendum, then the situation changes, and there is no UK government that would not.
My only point is you have to write this into a settlement in order that this
is Britain. We don't write things down.
Well, you have to write it into a settlement, and it has to be clearly understood under which circumstances it is permissible for the Scottish Government to hold such a referendum.
But it can never be permissible for one part of a state to have a unilateral right to hold a referendum on secession, without the approval of the national parliament. No. But
you can agree a constitutional mechanism. The dismemberment of the Scotland Act. It's perfectly straightforward.
No, but the dismemberment of the United Kingdom is clearly, and the law agrees agrees with me here, happily. It's clearly
the law,
a reserved matter.
The law agrees with you because that's the settlement. My point to you is that
there should be a different settlement.
The settlement is not fit for purpose. It is clearly not fit for purpose if a political party is capable of winning an election on a commitment to hold a referendum, but it doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so, and I accept that. The issue is whether or not that constitutional provision, as it amounts to strangling a national legislature in terms of its ambition, my view of that is that it is not fit for purpose.
But it's a devolved legislature. It can't,
That is a separate question from whether or not independence is a good or a bad idea.
No, I agree. It's a separate question and so on. But it is clearly unacceptable, I would suggest, for one part of the United Kingdom, a smaller part of the United Kingdom, to say, to say that we have the unilateral right to decide the outcome for the whole of the United Kingdom. Yeah. We may return to this issue.
He's in a bad mood. He's not even going to say cheers.